Justin, welcome to the show. How's it going?
I'm good, Matthew. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I've been in the air purifier space for a while as kind of biohacker, ex living in a moldy situation kind of was my original kind of health story, even though then it ended up being Lyme and all these other heavy metals and parasites that were kind of all involved, like toxicity overall, as I'm sure you're aware of. A lot of people have, but it was kind of my first time. I'm like, oh, I'm living in this moldy house, and then obviously that kind of gets you down a hamster wheel of just air purification and things like that. So I really like what you guys have been doing over at Jasper. But before we get into the device, why don't you tell us like your background and how you kind of got into like the air purification space? What sparked your interest there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in the air kind of like air quality, air education space for almost a decade now. My background actually in schooling was environmental science, so I've always had an interest in just any kind of really environments in general, indoor and outdoor. But obviously, the focus here is primarily indoor spaces. And actually, I've been working with the founder of Jasper. His name is Michael Feldstein. I've been working with him pretty much that entire time in the airspace. And we were at a company where we would do air quality consulting. That's really where this all started. So essentially, what that meant was people would call us. It was primarily homeowners. Maybe they were feeling sick at home or some kind of just off and not exactly sure. And they had usually gone down their own rabbit hole and kind of identified that it's maybe worth checking their air quality and seeing what's going on, whether in fact there is a problem or, hey, everything looks good. But that's what we were there to confirm. And so we would go to their houses. We would do basically an assortment of tests, everything from mold to dust, VOCs, different kind of, airborne contaminants, even sometimes things like asbestos and lead, for older houses there. And effectively, that would mean doing inspections, taking samples. We'd send them off to a laboratory, and then we would write a report for them and just identify, here's exactly what we found. Either A, everything looks good, no problem, at least for this contaminant, or, maybe B, you've got higher levels of this item. Here's what I might want to do. Or maybe, C, well, there's really a lot of stuff going on. And you may want to take a more aggressive approach to trying to remedy what's going on inside your indoor air. But we were effectively there as like a consultant to really tell them, this is what's happening. This is what the lab identified based on our own, expertise and sort of time in the field of doing this stuff. Here's what we might suggest is the best course of action. And so from that, you kind of see a lot of the same patterns come up over and over again. There's a huge variety of different kinds of pollutants and chemicals and contaminants, but you're often seeing the same sort of set of issues that come up in a lot of houses and indoor spaces. And so from that, what we kind of were leaning towards was that it's cool to identify the problem, but honestly, what feels a lot better is just getting a good solution for them. And that's really what tied us into Jasper, with this air scrubbing machine that we have, where it's to be honest, it's more or less the same cost of doing that whole test, but then not having the answer for them right there, or like the solution versus, here's a solution that for basically the same price gives you what you need to have, which is going to be helping to tackle a lot of those indoor air issues, whether it is mold or dust or VOCs. So it was a very natural and honestly a really good feeling to shift towards the solution side of things instead of sticking with kind of that, like third party, okay, we're just here to assess and nothing else. That was kind of the probably half decade journey that went from starting into testing to leading to Jasper to where it is now.
Oh, interesting. So back then it was more like consultation. You didn't have the actual physical device to sell them. You were just like, hey, probably maybe recommending other air purifiers. If you found mold, you might, say, hey, you might want to get this remediated or maybe move or so something has to happen because the mycotoxins are high or sometimes it might just be VOC. So you were kind of just like, I'm assuming probably just worked with specific brands and were just recommending stuff.
Mhm.
And then so how did you guys finally get over into developing Jasper? How, because from I've heard a few podcasts on it before. I'm pretty sure the technology seems advanced. It seems like it was actually used for like outdoor air quality, if I'm not mistaken. So how did you guys get into like from the consulting to just like, all right, we should develop something that's better than what at least what we think is better than everything on the market?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a lot of that is really Michael's story because he was in the environmental kind of like restoration and disaster space. So if there was a big flood or a fire, hurricanes, earthquakes, he would go in with his team and they would do remediation. So that's actually where he started before he got into the consulting space. So he was doing that. Then he kind of got into the consulting. But the whole time, what was always on his mind was, really wanting to find a good solution for a lot of the problems that would come up. Because, for example, they would go into a home that, let's say, had been hit by there was a localized wildfire. The home was, heavily damaged. So they would restore it, and then they'd say, okay, everything's fine. They do the test. Okay, the air is okay. People move back in, and then a week later, they're feeling quite sick, and family member goes to the hospital, and then they would go back and retest, and the air was just as toxic as it had been during the wildfire, even though the home had been restored. So from that, it was realizing that the industrial use products that they would use, which are called air scrubbers, were very effective, but the drawback is that they're typically very loud and they're honestly not that good looking. So, it's not really practical to have one of these in your home 24/7 because it's going to sound like a truck and it, looks kind of like a photocopier and a subwoofer mixed together. Like it's not really, you don't want that in the middle of your living room all the time. It's not going to look nice, but it does a really good job of cleaning the air. So what he kind of took from that was, let's develop a product that is suitable for the home, that runs quietly, that looks really beautiful, but also can tackle those issues with relatively the same capacity that the industrial machines can. So that's really where Jasper was born. And this was a long journey for him. Like, when I started working with him almost a decade ago, I mean, he was working on kind of developing a product, but it wasn't like what we see with the Jasper today. There was a lot of testing and a lot of different equipment that he had to run through and see, which ones work, which ones are not effective. Do you build it into the HVAC? Do you have it sit alone separate? So it was quite a journey that he was going through. But after a long while, we got, the Jasper to where it was. And that's really where it made sense to kind of transition out of the consulting space, into that just, hey, here's a good solution that works, plain and simple. And it was a lot nicer too, because when we were doing the consulting, we didn't even really want to recommend any brand. We would say get an air purifier, but we didn't work with any particular one. We didn't have any kind of referral system set up because we were very cautious about, we just want to be a third party investigator. We don't want to have any bias. We want to make people feel comfortable with the tests that we're doing. But it just makes so much more sense to just say, you know what, we believe in this. This works. Just get this. It's a much better way of doing things. And we can say definitively, we've helped a lot more people on the Jasper side of things than on the air quality testing side of things. And I say this as having personally tested over 3,000 homes in my day. So I've been into a lot of spaces, but the solution side just makes much more sense.
Yeah, and I get it where you're coming from because you've heard that I think there's certain laws that might even, I think even in Florida it might be like that, where the person who does like the mold consultation or does the inspection basically cannot also be the same people that remediate, because there's like a conflict of interest there where you might just say, yeah, you need $20,000 worth of work because I'm the guy getting the 20,000, when in reality you might have needed $1,000 or $2,000 worth of work. So I think there's
Exactly.
certain, I don't know if every state's like that. I think Florida is like that. It's been a while since I looked into it, but I know that I'm in Florida, but I think that's definitely the case some places. And so
Hmm.
some people try to not recommend things, and that's probably what you guys were doing with consulting. But then there's just such a vast array of quality of everything from air purification, where you're just looking at like cheapo ones on Amazon all the way up to, there's like $300 ones, $500 ones. Your guys is like a little over 1,000. So it's like if you just say, hey, get an air purifier, they might just snag like the cheapest one over on Amazon and not really get to the meat and potatoes of the getting all of their actual air quality issues. So it sounds like you had the scrubbers that worked really well, but obviously that was probably a quick cleanup from the wildfire or whatever natural disaster had occurred. But then obviously you were taking that machine out of the house because it was too loud and too obnoxious. So you wanted to do something different. So this is one concept that I think people, really need to understand, because you've mentioned it a couple times, the air scrubber
Hmm.
versus, like, obviously we have different ones. I've had Molecule over time, air doctors. They all seem to work okay. I'm not like trying to shun them or anything. They all did what they were supposed to do at the time. And those have like ultra HEPA and HEPA filters. So can we kind of differentiate for the audience, like the difference between like a HEPA or ultra HEPA filter compared to like an air scrubber, what the Jasper is? Because I think that's kind of like a unique way to distinguish between these and some of the other ones on the market.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, And we'll keep it very simple because you can see a lot of information out there, and you'll see a lot of different brands where some of them say ultra HEPA, some of them say HEPA, some say nothing. They do a completely different process, and it can be a little confusing to know which one is actually the right thing. But to really boil it down, like why what we've come up with the Jasper is that ultimately it's a HEPA air scrubber. So it's HEPA technology, which is not like it's not a unique thing to us. I mean, HEPA's been around for honestly the better part of the last century, and it's used typically for clean rooms and hospitals. It's used in NASA and the space stations as well. So it's HEPA is just used to effectively give you a very deep cleaning of your air quality. The thing is, what really matters is ultimately the size of the machine. That's kind of where more of the scrubber part would come into it, because you can have a HEPA filter that's the size of my water bottle. Um, sure, it'll give you a little bit around that space, but that's not going to work for your room. It's definitely not going to work for your house. So you need something that's the same kind of technology in terms of the efficiency of cleaning. That's where the HEPA part comes in. But it's how large that filter is. How big is the overall device? How much air can it move through it too? That's an important one, because technically speaking, like if you had a piece of tissue paper and you just gently blew on it, that would kind of act like a HEPA. Like, you wouldn't get much stuff going through it because you're barely applying any sort of linear force of air going through that. But obviously, with a high volume of air and a large fan, that tissue paper is going to be shredded. It's going to be useless. So you need something that not only can move a lot of air, but also a large filter to put that air through, kind of act as a medium for it. That way, the air that's coming out the other side in a large quantity is going to be very heavily cleaned. So that's kind of like how the HEPA technology works. So that's what the HEPA filter inside the Jasper is. Where we differ from a lot of the other brands is that, most, like you're kind of talking about say the $99 ones you might find on Amazon, a couple $100. That's what most people buy, just simply because it says HEPA, and it'll often say, oh, we clean this amount of airspace. And they say, great. And I'll put it in my bedroom. That's perfect. But the problem is that most of the time when those brands are talking about this is the airspace we clean, that's at the max setting. And even then it's an overall very small product, so it's not going to move that much air. The filter on those devices is at most maybe half a pound. So it's a fairly small thing. Like it's basically about the weight of the one that goes in your furnace filter. And a furnace filter itself is not really meant for air cleaning, but sometimes that gets confused. But it's kind of the same size. It's not that heavy duty. The Jasper filter itself is 4.5 pounds. So our filter can often be heavier than some of those really small devices that you'll find on Amazon. So that's really where the key difference maker is. It's the size of it and the strength, and it's the amount of air being moved through. The fan at top speed is running similar to what those industrial air scrubbers would have. I mean, some of those go obviously very large, and it's impractical to put that amount into a residential size model, but you can get kind of similarly on the low end of those industrial scrubbers. That's what the Jasper's doing. So that's really where we differentiate it as, it's the power of a scrubber, but it can still run quietly, and it has a strong filter, moves a lot of air, and ultimately, it looks nice. It's made of metal. It's sleek. So that's where a lot of the intentionality of the design came into place.
Yeah, I will agree. You guys did a good job on making it kind of like futuristic, modern looking. It's not an eyesore to look at in the space, which is often, especially more my wife. I'll put anything in here, but the wife likes it to look nice. So after we got one, she's like, "Yeah, it looks nice," and I got a couple more. So I have like three at the moment, and but yeah, the overall that makes sense because I've had other ones, and just like if people had a visual, like you could see it if you go to, like, I met you guys at the biohacking conference, and that's where I purchased my first one this year because I had already heard some shows about it, and I knew a few people that already had them and really liked them. And the sheer size of the filter is like, it looks like 10x, like it might only be like 5x, I don't know, but like when you can put it next to a couple other filters, you can just realize how much more it's capturing. And then I never really thought about that amount of airflow coming through the device, because you can tell when for people who may not have or had like an air doctor or Jasper, but they kind of pick up on particulate matter when you're cooking or whatever, and they kind of start to increase the speed automatically. And so the Jasper, I can tell when it's like on high speed, is actually like it's pushing a lot of air through.
Mhm.
which is good because obviously when I'm searing steaks or whatever, I kind of want that to kick up and get everything out of there. But it can grab some of your incense and some of your candles. Sometimes you might my wife likes to pop it off if she's burning sage or something because it literally will just
Right.
like suck the sage or suck the incense right out of the air and it's like non-existent. So pop it off for a half hour, an hour sometimes if we're trying to set the mood with some actual scents. But I mean, obviously, clearly, it's doing its job. So the scrubber is basically what, if I can understand this correctly, is just basically the amount of air flow when it's at max speed is getting to like the lower end of those industrial scrubbers. So it's more about air flow than it is
Exactly.
actual technology of like filtration.
Exactly, exactly. And that's the we want to make a distinction here. We don't want to say we've invented anything brand new or anything. Like it's HEPA, and we use HEPA because it works. We keep it very simple. We don't have add-ons, like we don't have ionization or ozone or any other kind of technology. It's just HEPA. HEPA works fantastic. Don't try to change what's not broken. It's really just the HEPA combined with the amount of air that's moving, combined with the size of the filter. That's what makes the Jasper perform so well for your airspace.
Yeah, because I think when sometimes like social media, you see quick clips or whatever, and people are kind of like, "Oh, it's an air scrubber instead," but it's pretty much the same technology, but it's the actual size and the air flow, and I've noticed a big difference in it, and I think it's definitely seems to be cleaning the air better than other ones that I've tried over time, and it's got to be just because of that air flow that's basically moving everything through. Um, Before we talk a little bit more about the technology and the Jasper itself, maybe you can break down to people. So you've been inside of a lot of these homes. Like, why should we focus on indoor air quality? If for a person who's never looked into this subject.
Absolutely. Well, and one of the ways you can really look at it as a reference point of why it's so important is that we look at air as kind of the third pillar of health. And the first and second ones being the water you drink and the food you eat. These are the consumables. And air is basically your consumable that you do subconsciously. We eat roughly 2 to 3 pounds of food a day. We drink maybe a quarter gallon or half a gallon of water. It depends on what you have. Maybe a gallon if you're really on top of your water consumption. But in terms of the air we breathe, we're talking. It's usually often around 15,000 breaths a day. So there's a very high volume of air that we're taking in, and not only that, but it's all the time. It's not just like you sit down for a meal of air like we do with food. It's constantly, and especially when you're doing things like sleeping or resting and recovering, the only thing that's keeping you alive at that time is the air. So what's really important is what's actually inside of that air inside your home. Because if you have, very poor air versus very good air, the person with good air is able to sleep better, they recover better, they can think better. There's so many different links to poor air and just overall health decline versus having good air inside your space. And a lot of the stuff that we would see when we would do the home testing, like for example, mold is probably one of the most common contaminants that you would find inside of a home. And the thing is, with mold, you find it outside naturally. So it's basically you're not going to have any. There's not really an issue with having mold inside because it's always found outdoors and it'll make its way inside your house. But the thing is, um, what matters is that it's if it's trapped inside your home, it's not able to go anywhere. That's where it can become a problem. So basically, you have the mold that's outside your home. You open your door or your window, spores come inside. Very normal process. And when you're outdoors, typically the mold's not going to bother you because there's wind, there's rain, there's factors that kind of move that mold around. So you're not having like this over accumulation of spores that's inside your breathing space there. But when you go home, typically most of our homes these days are built very airtight. So the air that gets inside is then trapped. And what that means is then you are then breathing and exposed to those higher levels of mold, those higher concentrations, and they're not able to go anywhere unless you actively filter it out of your airspace. Often what happens is when the mold comes in, that mold really tends to stay inside your house kind of indefinitely. And the thing with mold is that you can't really, like the spores, you can't kill them. There's this sort of this, misconception that, like, oh, I can kill the mold that's in the house. I mean, sometimes people will put products like if they see it growing on a wall, which you should do to try to tackle the active roots that it's maybe taking place in your drywall or your baseboard. But the spores that are in the air are virtually indestructible. And so if you don't have a medium to filter them out, what happens is that they then basically your lungs become the filter. So those spores, instead of being taken out of the air, they go into you. over time, especially if you have a sensitivity to mold, which a lot of people do, you can become quite ill. It could be simple things like just a lot more coughing or sneezing, but some people with asthma or other, immunocompromised, they can have pretty severe reactions to the mold. And that's just one of the many parameters that we would measure when we would do air quality testing. So we would see a lot of cases where someone had been suffering for years and years, and it could be quite tricky too, because you'd have a case where one family member feels completely fine and the other family member is really suffering. But it's then hard to say, well, why is this going on? Like, I feel fine. Why is my wife hurting or why is my child hurting when I feel okay? And what it comes down to is it's, that air that you're breathing in all the time. So that's why it's such an important thing to, at the very least, be air aware, as we like to say. Just being conscious of that as a first step is a huge milestone, and then working towards building a healthier home environment for yourself.
Yeah, I totally agree that that point about different people reacting differently is actually very critical. That's what happened when we moved into mold. My wife didn't really seem to be too bothered by it. She was out of the house a lot more than me. I would work from home a lot, so I was in the actual house more. Plus, I had a lot more like heavy metal and other toxicities that were accumulated more than her, I believe. And so I was like just basically kind of collapsed after like 3 months of being in there. Started seeing functional doctors and getting all these crazy diagnoses when in reality it was just the home itself. And she didn't really get symptoms until we'd lived there for a few years. And really, it was mostly after COVID, because during COVID she wasn't going out of the house working and running her business and everything. So she was in the house a lot, and we were just kind of hanging out. We'd go out in the backyard for a bit, but mostly inside. And so she started to get way more symptoms after that, and that's when I started to look into the house more. So you can definitely have certain people reacting differently to whether it's the VOCs or the mold, or I'm sure you guys this Jasper grabs a little bit of everything, right? I know the HEPA kind of like talks about particulate matter and the size of particles. Does the Jasper grab basically everything that you could think of? Is there anything that gets by the Jasper?
Yeah, I mean, great question. So overall, it's going to capture a very high amount of most of the what we call the fine particulates in the airspace. So, like for a reference point, HEPA, basically to be defined as a HEPA filter, it has to be able to capture 99.97% of particles down to the zero point zero 0.03 micrometer size range. So to kind of put that simply, a lot of the common pollutants, like whether it's mold spores or pollen or smoke or pet dander, anything of that sort, that usually all falls kind of above that zero point zero 0.03 micrometer size range. So all of those items are fair game for a HEPA filter to capture. Those are the kind of things that we expect that the HEPA filter will capture quite well. Now, obviously, what can happen is, you have to, of course, change the filter, because it'll get to a point where it's eventually overloaded and then it's compromised. It's not able to effectively filter out those items anymore. It's going to, become too kind of clogged up. So then it's not going to work at that point. So filter has to be changed, but during its lifespan, which generally is around 6 months, it'll work very well to capture those items. That being said, even while it is still in that sort of time frame, there are different kinds of contaminants and particulates you can have in airspace that may be smaller than that zero point zero 0.03, and may have a trickier time to be captured. So, for example, one that we often get asked a lot is about viral particles. So, things like viruses, those can sometimes be below that zero point zero 0.03 micrometer size range. So on an individual level, those particles may be able to bypass the HEPA filter and go through and end up back in the airspace. The good news, though, about that is there's really two things. The first one is, often if it ends up sort of getting through on that first pass through, the second time around, because air is constantly being cycled in the room when you have an air scrubber running, often on those later pass throughs, it will end up getting trapped in some way in the meshes of the HEPA there. But the other thing is that often these very small items, and another one that often comes up is mycotoxins, which individually can be smaller than zero point zero 0.03, they often tend to amalgamate with other particles in the airspace. So what that means is that whether it's aerosolized like water droplets or other kinds of particles or particulates, they can often end up clumped together, and then that amalgamation as a whole gets caught in the HEPA filter. So In that sense, they tend to be very effective at helping to remove the vast majority. You'll never get your air down to zero particulates. It's just not possible. But we are talking, even on a kind of a macro level for large amount of particles, often about a 98, 99% reduction. We had a lab test done earlier this year where mold was aerosolized and introduced into a room of around it was about 4,000 cubic feet, so around 500 square feet, 8-foot ceiling. So kind of think of that as like a standard hotel room, basically.
Hmm.
And they had a Jasper running in the space. They took an air sample at the beginning and then cultured the mold, and then they redid the air sample after every hour. And what we found after 2 hours was there was a 99% reduction in available mold to be cultured from that airspace there. After 3 hours, it was effectively about 100% reduction. There's very, very microscopic amounts left. But what it meant was that as long as the Jasper was running in that space, the amount of mold that was able to be pulled out of the air and then grown in the petri dish after a few hours, basically zero. So what that shows is that you can have a very significant reduction. Let's say you put it in your bedroom, that's going to be a very easy space to take care of because you have a lot of air being cycled through in a large filter in a relatively small amount of airspace. So that's how these kind of things can work very well with, down to small particles.
Yeah, awesome explanation. And I've seen that study on your guys' website, and I've recommended your technology to a few people who were kind of moving in and out of some mold. I mean, we had two giant hurricanes here last year, so it's like you could throw a rock down the street and a house has mold because we had the both of them back to back last year here in Tampa, Florida. We kind of got double whammied there, and it was just a lot of destruction, and it tore down the baseball stadium here, and lots of remodeling, rebuilding. I have one room in my condo that I can't use right now. They're working on redoing the HOAs, redoing the roof, and then we got to do some remediation. But luckily, the rest of the house came back normal. It was just the one room where the leak was. I have a Jasper in there with the door closed, but it was my baby's nursery, so my baby was actually having some neurological stuff, and then I pulled him. They were called breath holding spells. They were kind of weird. They weren't super alarming. We didn't go to the hospital, but he was kind of holding his breath and looked like he lost
Mm,
consciousness. Like it was like a nervous system thing. It would be like when he fell over, which kids always fall over, but then he would kind of like hold his breath for a second, and it was kind of scary, obviously. And we were about to go see like a functional neurologist, and then I just did a mold test, and lo and behold, his room was the only room that was super toxic. And so I got him out of there, and I got him on some minerals and stuff like that. But basically, he's only done it like one time, I think, since he's been out of that room a few months. So which makes sense because mold just doesn't go away in one day. And once one, I was like, my wife's like, "Oh, why do he still have another spell?" I'm like, "Well, the mold's still got to take some time to get out of his body if he was in there for 6 months with it." But it's crazy because it didn't look like much. You didn't really even notice a leak, but there was roof leak, and you couldn't really see it. And then it happened to go into his space. But yeah, I have a Jasper in there now, and there's also a lot of humidity issues, right? Do you recommend like dehumidifiers and stuff like that? Because from what I live in Florida, so I run multiple of them,
sure.
pretty much continuously. Because from what I've heard, it's kind of back to where you were talking about how these like different toxins will kind of become amalgams. I've heard that when the humidity is too high, the VOCs or the dust and the molds, they kind of like air travel through the air and you can't even see them, and you breathe them in even more than if the humidity was in the correct place. So or do you have people who focus on humidity as well?
Absolutely, yeah, and humidity is a very important part of indoor air quality as well, and especially like a case like yours, where of course you live in Florida, humidity is very, very high. So if you don't do anything about it, it's much, much more likelihood for mold and those other issues to come up. But as far as the the amount of like the particle activity, yes, so we've seen that as well, and we used to see that when we do our home assessments. It wasn't unusual that the homes that had higher humidity, and I'm talking, where it was elevated, like we would consider elevated humidity above 60%. When you get above 60% relative humidity, that's where the chance for mold to develop does become a lot higher. So that was kind of that magic number of like, if you're above 60, you really need to tackle it ASAP. Um, Optimal range is usually between like kind of 40 to 50-ish%. That's where you don't want it to be too high, of course, but also you don't want to go too low because you can dry out, your nasal passages and, have issues maybe sometimes breathing or raw throats, that kind of thing.
We learned that
So
pretty quickly. Because like I cranked it when I first started getting into it. My wife's like, "Dude, my throat is dry. Like, I can't breathe right." I'm like, "Okay, maybe I'm pushing the limits of
yeah,
the dehumidifier here."
for sure. Yeah, you can't overdo it. So something to consider. But yes, what we'd find is that when the humidity was higher, and often just higher humidity usually meant higher temperatures as well inside the space. When you have higher temperature and humidity, gases, so things like VOCs, which are a gas, they do move more freely inside your airspace. They are able to just there's I'm maybe kind of going back to my physics lessons a little bit from university and high school, but it tends to be a thing a bit more kinetic energy with those compounds. And so when you have higher humidity, they can move more freely, and especially with higher temperatures, those gases move a bit more freely in the airspace. And we'd often see higher rates of off gassing when temperatures were higher inside of a home, especially when it was sealed up very tight. So there definitely is a correlation where the humidity is not just tying to potential mold, but more free movement of those gases and compounds that you don't want to be breathing in too much of a concentration. So dialing in the humidity, making sure it's not too low, but also especially not too high. Very important part of keeping a healthy home.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I wanted to touch on that. And another piece that I think a lot of people overlook, I'm not sure if you have ways to, because back to this kind of idea here that we did start to build things. For one, I believe we started to use cheaper materials just because we were cutting costs a little bit. But then also from like an energy standpoint, we started to make homes less breathable. And I've had shows with other mold experts where they talk about like the Amish, they actually build barns and stuff that are breathable. They don't really deal with mold in the way we do because but they're also like, they don't have electricity and they don't have to care about like certain things. So it's like different for
Mhm.
them, right? We don't want to blast the AC in Florida all day and it just goes right outside. It kind of defeats the purpose there. But so I get why they kind of started to build everything so tight, but then that just traps everything in. And another issue I think that some people, you might have some better wisdom around this than me, is what I think a lot of people, especially in Florida, because it is pretty hot and you're running the AC, where they basically never really crack the windows except for like these small periods of time of the year where it maybe gets a little bit colder and the air's not running. But those are pretty short lived. Where it's down in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, like it gets right back up in where it's like 80 and the AC is pretty much running year round. But what starts to happen is you start to also off gas yourself, and you start to breathe out a lot of CO2 with no oxygen flow coming in. So, do you have any recommendations, or what would be the issue around a CO2 issue? I don't think the Jasper helps for any of that, but it's just kind of another air quality question around CO2 and oxygen exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought it up because yes, CO2 is a again, it's a very very important part of air quality and one that's often overlooked. I think a lot of people focus on like, okay, the particulates, the contaminants, like maybe, humidity as well, the dehumidifier, what have you. But CO2 is often overlooked. And it's a very common thing that, we keep our homes sealed up, doors closed, windows closed, even like when we go into our bedroom at night and then we close the bedroom door, you're sealing yourself within a seal of your home. So it's what happens then is, as you're mentioning, we respire CO2. When we talk, when we breathe, it comes out of us. We're the main contributors of CO2 inside our homes. And that was always a bit of a funny one is that, we would do CO2 as part of our air testing. And so we would test someone's home and the CO2 is very high. And they'd say, oh my, where does this come from? Because they're thinking like, is it from my stove? Is it from my, whatever? I say, it's from you. Like you're the source ultimately of the CO2 existing inside your home. And so the problem is then you're sealing up, you're creating, kind of this bubble that you're living in, almost like you're inside of like a Tupperware container. And so that air has nowhere to go. It's not able to exchange and the CO2 starts to build up. And as you were mentioning, Matthew, what happens, when there's no oxygen coming in like fresh air, that CO2 can reach fairly high levels where it can cause some acute problems, but also kind of long term as well if you're never in a space where it's sort of like decompressing and allowing the CO2 to come out and cycle through. So if you're in a space where the CO2 is very high, you can have things like brain fog, general fatigue, um, there's been a lot of studies actually of cognitive performance tying into, like declining when the CO2 goes up inside of a space. It's just because there's not enough fresh air, not enough oxygen. Your body needs that. But if you're in a space of constant CO2, these problems will tend to accumulate. One of the other issues as well that does tie into other aspects of indoor air is when the CO2 is high, this indicates that the air is very stagnant. So high CO2 often means higher mold, higher dust, because your air is not cycling through, it's not ventilating well. So all those items that would have built up inside your space, or accumulate from before, now they're not going anywhere, or it's taking a much longer time for them to kind of ease themselves out and go out. So a hugely important aspect of maintaining good air quality is simple ventilation. And then that is literally as simple as opening a window or opening a door. Obviously, weather permitting. I mean, if it's 120 degrees out, not super practical to have your windows open for a while. But even a little bit of just allowing some air to come through directly, get a cross breeze, open one window on one side of the house, another on the other side, that can flush out a lot of CO2. And then there is, one benefit of sort of this energy movement that we're in, like kind of the energy conservation of keeping homes, which has made them very airtight. But one of the positives has been looking at least improving the air exchange in your home at a lower cost. This often comes in the form of what's called an HRV or an ERV. HRV being heat recovery ventilation unit, ERV is energy recovery ventilation unit. Effectively, they do the same thing, which is to exchange the air. One of the key differences, it will depend what climate you're in, because if they want to preserve more humidity, like you might, for very cold and dry climates, you want to preserve humidity a bit more. So that's where they might switch it up between ERV or HRV. But they're doing ultimately the same main task, which is to help ventilate your home without you having to open the doors or the windows. And so, this is where modern HVAC systems, usually we'll find this with homes built in the last probably 10 years or so, often have one of these built into the furnace. And these are good things because this is, they're taking into account that, okay, most of the time, pretty much anywhere across a lot of the country in North America, you more often than not have your HVAC running, whether it's AC or your heater or your furnace. So the important thing is now they've built this into your HVAC system, and that means that as long as it's running, you're able to help exchange the air and remove some of that CO2 and bring in fresh air without opening the doors or windows. So it is a cost-effective way of actually balancing the air inside your home. So bit of a long-winded explanation there, but that is a positive of one of the ways you can help to improve your CO2 is with a good air exchange system there.
Yeah, actually, I wanted you to bring that up because I've looked into those ERVs and HRVs before, and I'm not sure if I could put one in my room or not. We got HOA. I thought about trying to sneak one out there and just see what they say, because people have all kinds of different stuff on their porch. I know they definitely don't want you to like grill out there because you can like cause a fire, but I think I've never really seen one of those systems in person, so I didn't know like how like noticeable it really would be if it was like clunky on the outside, or if it was just like a little bit of a cracked window might be okay. But from what I understand is that when you're bringing in that fresh oxygen, also it's actually harder for like mold and different things to actually even take up your space, because you're kind of just the airflow itself is almost like a cleaner, like the natural oxygen. And so when you have that high CO2 levels, it's just kind of like this crazy breeding ground we've created of just like contaminants, molds and anything that you can think of. Even like a lot of people who even come to me in Florida, they just bought like a house that was just built because Tampa's been like re-gentrifying, everything. It's like one of the fastest growing cities in the country. It's pretty crazy. I've lived here for a while, and it's just remarkable how many nice houses and stuff they're building. But they'll build them. I'll walk by my neighborhood. They'll be building these what looks like $5 million mansion behind me, and legitimately will be building it like all the woods out there getting rained on because Florida's all rainy, and the mold, and then and then the other aspect I would think about would be like that ERV or HRV system. But it does sound like maybe some of these new builds might actually have those built in. I wasn't aware of that code or not, but they're basically bringing in oxygen so that you don't build up all the CO2, and then whether or not it's hot or cold climate will depend on which device you would get. So like I would need one in Florida that would basically not blow all the humidity in from outside, because that would obviously be counterintuitive to even do.
Exactly. Yep. You nailed it. That's exactly right. And really, a good analogy that you can use is, the reason that like bringing in the fresh air is so important is that you can kind of liken air in a way to water in the sense that generally moving air is better than still air. When you have a river that's flowing, you tend to not have a lot of algae and bacteria accumulate and other kind of pathogens. But, and obviously this could be a big problem in Florida when there's hurricanes, and then you have the after effects and the flooding, and then you have basement, or I guess you don't have too many basements there, but just even low-lying areas where the water sits and it's still, and you get, the mosquitoes and the bacteria and everything builds up all those pathogens. The still water is generally much dirtier than the moving water. So it's kind of the same thing with air, is you want your air in your home effectively to be in a way like a river, where it's moving, it's cycling through. You don't want it to be sitting still and stagnant, because that's where the stuff builds up. So having, the air exchange, or just having windows open if the climate's favorable for it, getting the oxygen through, getting the air moving through. That's really helping to flush out a lot of that bad stuff that otherwise would be accumulating inside of your airspace there.
Yeah. What was I just had lost my train of thought on that. I wanted to talk about. Oh, I had it right on the tip of my tongue. Um, oh yeah, with the new build, since I was kind of chatting on that a little bit. How often when you were in spaces, you might not have got called into too many new builds, but maybe you did if a family member got sick. A lot of people don't realize that the new builds are almost sometimes worse if depending on the materials,
Mm.
which I would say 99% of construction people aren't worried about VOCs and off gassing. How bad is like off gassing for the first few years? If you were someone who just bought a new build and you were excited, you would think that it would have, the least amount of, mold or whatever. How bad are these like new builds when it comes to like air quality?
I'm glad you asked, because it is a funny concept, that you would certainly expect that a new build should be fine. Often people think, oh, it's, the older homes that are full of mold and other stuff that's built up over the years, but absolutely not true. We see a lot of spaces of older homes that were maintained really well, built well, but actually did ventilate, and were pretty good from an air quality perspective. And then we saw new homes that had a lot of issues going on. So there are a couple of avenues that we can look at with this one. I would say, first of all, the first one was there were some new builds that were often kind of those like cookie cutter neighborhoods where every house looks the same, and I get it. From it's easy to build, it's easy to just they don't have to think about the planning too much. They just get the blueprint and they copy it for the neighborhood. Makes sense. But what we often saw was that time quotas and cost quotas had to be met, and so naturally corners were cut, things were rushed. We saw a number of cases where things were just straight up missed that should not have been missed in that home. I remember getting called into one where there was there was no flashing put on the roof, and so when it rained, all this water that should have ran off, normally, um, went into the house, and this brand new home was chock full of mold. I'm talking wall to wall, all across the upstairs because of the water that rained in, simply because they didn't put flashing on the roof. Like something so obvious, but they missed it. Um, and that led to, this homeowner having a nightmare scenario where it's like this new build that should have been all good. Now they were, it was causing health problems, and of course all the money and time to fight in the legal battles against the builder. So we would see stuff like that. Other cases where I remember one where there was a new build, and the concrete foundation in the basement, they hadn't allowed it to fully cure before they put the vapor barrier over top. And so that led to, all this moisture that had kind of built up just from inside that kind of like membrane seal. That led to a bunch of mold issues, with mold coming out into the space. And I remember she had an elderly family member there that was getting very sick. Like he actually had to move out. He was just too sick to live in what should have been their new home that he was going to, retire in and basically live in the rest of his life. So we would see stuff like that where these new builds that you would think shouldn't have a problem, this came up. Now, on the other avenue of things, this is probably the more common, because those are a little bit of extreme examples, but the more common cases were situations where these new builds, as you were mentioning, the off gassing can be very significant. And a lot of times with these new materials, the homes are built, like you said, that the builders usually, even if they're following all the code and everything properly with the build itself, they're not really thinking about material off gassing. Like that's just not a common protocol of house building, unless they're super conscious about it. But that's, the very, very, very rare point oh whatever percent. So most builders, they build a home and then it's all done. Okay, you move in, it's great. But the issue is that everything in that home, from the drywall to the floorboards, the carpeting, and of course new furniture, the paint, everything is brand new. So all kinds of chemicals and materials, even if they say low VOC, because that's often when that gets advertised. Again, this is something that we would see quite a lot where it's advertised as low VOC, but we take our readings. Turns out VOCs were still very high. And so the problem then is that all of these materials are producing and off-gassing VOCs into the airspace. And again, then because the home is built so tightly, so energy efficient, they're not really going anywhere. And sometimes you get the obvious case like, okay, you can walk into a home, oh, it really smells like paint. I'm going to open the windows. That's the very obvious and quick solution. And it still helps. I mean, definitely better than not doing it. But often what'll happen is after, let's say, a little bit of time, that there's not like such an obvious new house smell. So it seems that, okay, everything's fine. There's no problem. But as a matter of fact, the VOCs actually were still quite high, even if you couldn't really smell them per se. So it's a very normal situation that the VOCs tend to build up in these new homes. And unless you're really taking efforts to off gas and to, open the windows and let the off gassing happen, let it go out, let fresh air come in, you can have fairly long periods of time where those chemicals are still building up. I actually remember one example of this. There was it wasn't a new build. It was like maybe a newer-ish home, but they put in new flooring on their upstairs. And we got called into this house and they wanted to do a test for formaldehyde because they had done a little bit of research. They found that where the flooring was sourced from had a potential of having formaldehyde off-gassing into the airspace. Now, we do see formaldehyde in a lot of materials, but usually it's at a low enough amount that it's not really a health concern. But formaldehyde can be a pretty potent chemical when it's airborne and when you have high enough concentration. And this particular gentleman had this flooring put in. He'd actually had it for over 2 years. And we went and did the air test. The formaldehyde was still at a level above recommended guidelines by all government health standards. And he actually got quite sick. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, he had developed a cancer while he was in the home. And they were, relatively certain it was tied to the formaldehyde exposure because he was breathing that every single day at this level that was above the recommended threshold. So this was a case of off-gassing literally for years and years and years. So, it can happen in pretty much any kind of situation where there's new materials put inside of a house.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a new build. It can be a flip. A lot of people are, buying cheap houses that need a lot of work. They make it up all nice, flip it, and then they're trying to make money on it, obviously, which is fine. But you should still be aware that a lot of that brand new kitchen that you're seeing in the photos of that house you're about to buy, or that brand new bathroom, is probably they're going to off gas for quite a while. And it's just something to be aware of for people who really think that the newer houses are like ultimately the best. To be honest, sometimes maybe a house that's like 5 years old might be a little bit better for somebody than that's actually
Yep.
brand new. But people like the new feel. I just think you should have some Jaspers or some kind of air exchange going on to just pay attention to it. I'm not telling you not to buy your brand new dream house or anything. I'm just saying there's going to be VOCs even if there's no mold or any kind of water damage in that brand new house, and you should pay attention to that and then try to make sure everything's good. I wanted to ask you a question because you kind of said along the line there that you didn't think that the HVAC filters much air. I've had I'm drawing a blank on his name right now, but he's the owner of hypoallergenic air. He kind of approaches mold and air purification slightly different. He likes a technology called polar ionization, where he thinks it kind of targets and kills things through his. He's got plugins and he's got things you can put on the HVAC. But
Mm-hmm.
I use some of his plugins. They seem okay. I'd already bought them. I'm not sure if they're really working, but I like living in Florida. If the technology kills a little bit of mold, I'm happy with it. And he seemed like a pretty knowledgeable guy. But he has these HVAC filters that have a carbon block on them, so you can pick the MERV
Mm.
setting, and then they have a carbon block. And I've noticed that my air has definitely seemed like it's improved since I've started using those like a couple of years ago. And I was wondering because his thought process is that's going to filter like or the most air moving around in your house is going to go through the HVAC because your
Mhm.
air conditioner or whatever's running at all times. So why not put like instead of just a MERV, like MERV 13 or whatever you use, why not put a carbon block on there? And it does seem like it captures quite a bit more. So I didn't know if you guys had any future thoughts around anything around HVAC, or are you solely just working on just the straight Jasper systems?
Yeah, yeah, great question. And I'll clarify my point I was making from earlier. When I was talking about the HVAC filter not really filtering your air, what I mean is the standard furnace filter. You know, the one that you maybe change every 3 months or so is pretty normal. Um, those can sometimes get misconstrued as being an air cleaner, but they're not. What those are designed to do is protect your furnace from large clumps of like dust or debris that naturally end up in your vents and then blown around the HVAC. You don't want that stuff to hit your furnace because that can cause some issues down the line. So those furnace filters are really just designed to capture the large that you can see the big visible like things of dust and whatnot. And it's usually a good idea to maybe get a duct cleaning every few years just to help flush out the stuff that builds up. But that's more what we're referring to, where the furnace filter does not clean your air because really it's not designed as any kind of a HEPA system, at least the standard ones. Any kind of small particle is going to get bypassed super easily. That's kind of like the tissue analogy I was referring to before. Those furnace filters are a lower, usually they go by a MERV rating. So typically, the lower the MERV rating you have, the less sort of basically it's farther and farther away from what would be like a HEPA filtration because they're not as densely woven. But that's actually not a bad thing. The reason for that too is you want to be a little bit careful with going too sort of over aggressive on your MERV filter inside your furnace, because what can happen is if the MERV rating is very high, you can end up choking out the airflow a little bit. It just means that the system has to work harder to move the air through, which means energy bills go up because now it's having to
Mm-hmm.
cycle the air through more often, or it's more difficult to get it through the furnace filter. So that can be a little bit of a drawback. But that's really what we mean, is that the furnace filter, kind of the standard ones, they are important, but don't look at it as by itself cleaning your air. You need some other accessory, whether it was a different, like something built into the HVAC, like a whole HEPA system, or a standalone product like Jasper Air Scrubber. You need something additional. Don't rely on just the furnace filter to actually clean your airspace there.
Yeah, great point because I don't think it's cleaning everything, but I have noticed that there's a lot more trapped on there since I did like the better MERV and then the carbon block. So I definitely think the air is a little bit cleaner, just from maybe grabbing bigger stuff that the HEPA would also probably grab, but it's just another little pit stop for me to grab some other stuff that might be circulating in my air. And I have noticed yeah, I forgot to change it for like a few months when I usually do like every month on that just to keep up on
Mhm.
it. And it started to seem like the air was a little stagnant in my office. I'm like, maybe I need to change the filter. It was definitely because it's grabbing more than a normal furnace filter. Because the MERV rating's a little bit higher. I'm glad you
Mhm.
touched on that because you can't go too high with the MERV or your air just doesn't blow through your house, or it does, but the thing is just working double time and it's really probably not good from an energy standpoint, but I would imagine that just extra work on the HVAC, it would probably run it down quicker. You're thinking of the span of how long an HVAC stays healthy. You don't want to overwork it all the time. It's like
Mhm.
hitting the gas on your car, pedal to the floor nonstop. You're gonna grind some gears and take it out there. But it does seem like it traps a little bit extra. And then obviously I still have the air scrubbers and the Jaspers and everything. But I think it's a good line of defense. Seems to grab some extra dust, cat hair, stuff like that. You can see it in there with that. So that's been cool. So I didn't know if you guys had any. Sounds like you're just sticking with the Jasper machine. No future ideas of HVAC or anything else?
You know what? Long term, we do actually visit Jasper, probably more of an HVAC transition. Not for the immediate though. Like really, our main focus right now has been to develop, the best air scrubbing device that we can for your home. That's portable, easy to set up, easy to change the filter. I mean, it takes 30 seconds. Down the line, we'll very likely just, because indoor air is obviously such an important thing, and having like good humidifier, like a whole home system, like a humidification system, or air balancing system. We do actually want to get into all that stuff just because we understand the importance of it. We have the knowledge of it, and so it'd be really nice to have kind of a really full home functioning system that tackles everything. So this would be like a longer term kind of down the line. But for now, really the focus is just kind of the standalone product that we have here. Really, what keeps it simple too is that um, because sometimes people ask, what's is there a benefit of having the Jasper standalone versus having the built-in in the HVAC? And so one of the ways that we look at it, at least from our current perspective, is that it makes it simple where if you're ever going to be moving, you can just take your Jasper with you. Obviously, if you have something built into the HVAC and you move homes, you're probably not going to disassemble the home and take all that stuff and move it with you. So it does make it a bit easier from that perspective of just having something you can plug and unplug from the wall. And also to focus on the most important areas of your home too. Because with your HVAC, when you have the built-in system, you're kind of getting the same rate of distribution across all the vents. So not really a bad thing in theory, but it just means that, in actuality, like you're getting the same rate of air cleaning in, let's say, your laundry room or your bathroom versus your baby's room. Obviously, you want to focus the most efforts that you can on the baby's room. So that's where, you plug in your Jasper, your air scrubber in the baby's room there, you're getting the most direct benefit in the space that the baby's breathing in, which of course is going to matter the most for its, healthy upbringing inside of your home.
Yeah, I can attest to that. After having I had a tiny air doctor in there, but obviously the mold was so crazy that I don't even trust putting him back in there. Excuse me. I don't even trust putting him back in there even with the Jasper. I'm just like, we're kind of lucky because he's only one, so we can just have him right
Mm.
in there. Put the crib in our room, and no need to even say, oh, no need to even to guess on it and see if the Jasper's probably doing its job. I'm sure might be okay to go back in there, but I'm like, I'll just wait for the remediation because he was having the breath holding spells and that was a little scary. But I still think that it does do its job. I'd like the science that's on the website showing all the things about grabbing the mold. Or is there any other unique things around the Jasper that people should be aware of? I know that there's a reading on top for sure that we can get
Mhm.
into. Is that telling like how much particulate matter is in the air at the current time that's flowing through the Jasper?
Exactly. So the number that's on the screen is what it's referring to specifically is what's called PM 2.5. So PM 2.5 is essentially a particle that's in the 2.5 micrometer size range or less. Um, the reason that we focus on that one for the sensor is because PM 2.5, you're starting to get into the range of stuff that is much more easily able to enter the lungs and even the bloodstream as well. We have, of course, our nose hairs are kind of like a natural air filter in the body, but that stops, larger stuff from getting in. But PM 2.5, it's very, very small. It's able to bypass that and can get into, again, the lungs, and it can cause issues over time if you have high levels of it. Like most of these studies that you'll find on poor air quality around the world, most of those health and kind of government studies are all focusing on PM 2.5 because this is the one that's often can be the most dangerous when you have high levels of it. And the thing is, PM 2.5 represents a pretty broad spectrum of particulates. So, it's kind of going back to like what is the HEPA capture? Like it's really a lot of that stuff in the PM 2.5 mold, general kind of dust, allergens, debris, like dust mites, smoke, pet dander, any kind of those fine particles, pollen, all of those are often that PM 2.5 range. So the number that's on the Jasper screen is measuring the mass of total PM 2.5 in your airspace. And to kind of break it down specifically, let's say your screen is showing 0.005. What that means is that there's it's micrograms per cubic meter of air of your PM 2.5, which again, it's not saying like you have that amount of smoke or pollen. It's everything put together in the PM 2.5 range. That's the mass of it in the airspace. So we want it to be very transparent with showing you exactly what's in your airspace, because a lot of other, purifiers and products in the market, they don't have any kind of screen. So there's a lot of guesswork. Like you don't actually know, how polluted is my air in the space. But with the Jasper, it's very transparent. You can get the exact measurement of how much PM 2.5 do I have. Most of the time, we should see a fairly low reading because really that just means that the air is stable. But we don't want to make any, don't make a mistake about it. Like as long as it's plugged in and running, it's still keeping the airspace very clean. There's a lot of other small contaminants that don't show up on that reading that still get captured in the HEPA filter. That's kind of the main way that the Jasper can keep score, if you will, of what your air is. So you usually would see a low reading most of the time, but if you have an event where there's a sudden uptick in PM 2.5, which probably one of the most common ones would be, if you're like cooking something very meat heavy, there's a lot of smoke on the stove, that's where it'll ramp up very quickly because you're introducing a very acute source of PM 2.5, which in that case would be from like the cooking fumes and the stove and the meat in the pan. That is all creating PM 2.5 at a very rapid rate. The Jasper senses that, the number goes up, the color goes from green to orange to red or yellow to red. And then what happens is it then picks up on that. The fan ramps up because it wants to cycle the air through more quickly. And then once it senses that the air is starting to calm down, the fan drops down automatically. And then it goes back to the green state. The fan will drop very low, very whisper quiet. So that's really where, when you have high levels of PM 2.5 very quickly, it goes into that, kind of the scrub mode. That's where it's really doing the deep clean of your air only as much as necessary. And then it goes back to a quiet setting. So you don't have to touch a thing. It does it all for you. And there's nothing you have to really think about in that sense.
Yeah, that's the best part. It just kind of kicks on. I want to ask, so for the people that might not understand, what are the toxic compounds in food? Like you hear this, like you would think like, oh, I'm just cooking a steak, it's just oil, butter, whatever. But from what I've gathered is actually that searing steaks and cooking like that is actually pretty toxic. What are the toxic compounds and what's happening there in the human like system when we're breathing that in?
Yeah, absolutely. So Um, it is an interesting one because you think that just obviously even like really good organic food is purely good for you, and I mean it is for sure. Eat good food, of course, but you can get the byproducts of cooking that food. That's really where you can get some air quality contaminants that come up. So some of the main ones would be, let's say you're using various kinds of spices or oils in your cooking. So what happens is at very high heat, those become aerosolized, and that basically can be a form of a VOC. Like that's, a VOC, a volatile organic compound. Um, it is a VOC that ends up accumulating inside your airspace when you're cooking. Now, usually it's not like it's going to be an amount that would be that harmful for you. But if you have prolonged cooking, a lot of stuff going on, or constant kitchen activity, you can have higher amounts of VOCs building up from, these oils, these spices, these different kinds of products that you're using inside your cooking now. Another very common one that relates to meat is what are called PAH. PAH are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. What that is, kind of put simply, these are actually the same contaminants that can come up from a wildfire. Because what happens is when you have very high heat combined with the protein, that breaks down to create those PAHs that go into your airspace. Again, cooking a steak, not anywhere close to the health impact that a wildfire would have, but it's the same kinds of compounds that are coming up inside your airspace there when you're cooking the steak. And the really important, I think, distinction that gets overlooked as well is that as humans, I mean, we've been cooking meat and cooking things on hot stoves and fire for thousands and thousands of years. The more recent shift, though, is actually doing that inside. I mean, we used to cook outdoors. We'd have fires outside. There'd be like a communal cooking space. Even when you'd have, kind of like hot structures and spaces being built, they weren't these airtight sort of bubbles that we have now. So even as cooking was shifted indoors, which again, on the human scale is very, very minuscule amount of time, there still wasn't the same effect as now, whereas we're now living in these very tight, very energy efficient spaces that don't have a lot of good air exchange in general. So now you're bringing that cooking stuff that generally wasn't really thought of as a problem into your indoor space. It's just, kind of those things of one more topic to be aware of when it comes to the indoor environment. It's because it's been such a short time scale of cooking inside. We're now starting to measure these things and actually seeing that, what, there are, albeit small, but some negative air quality impacts from just day-to-day stuff like cooking.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's listening to my show, I'd imagine they cook like I do. We're cooking at separate times, even so. The stove's probably on 6, 7 times a day sometimes because I'll cook.
Hmm.
I'm out on a different schedule sometimes than my wife and the baby because they're just stay at home mom life and eating on their schedule, and sometimes I'm eating differently, and we do dinner together most of the time. But yeah, the stove's on 3, 4, 5 times a day. It's not always smoking a steak, but it could be cooking ground beef or chicken or anything
Hmm.
that kind of off gases, and I think that's an overlooked one. Is there any other common things that you think people should be aware of that's kind of making their air quality more toxic that they could easily swap out or, get rid of?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the common items that we'll see in households, whether it's like scented candles or those air, and I use these quotes very strongly, fresheners, the things that you plug into the wall. I mean, really, you're just all those are doing is introducing VOCs. Like it's really just introducing more amounts of chemicals into the airspace there. Um, there's this very common misconception that a clean home smells like chemicals, like a lemon scent or something that, you walk in and it's very obvious that there's been this strong disinfectant used and you go, oh, well, oh, my house is clean. But all you've done is really introduced a lot of, you may have, sure, you've taken the grease off the countertop, but then you've introduced a lot of chemicals to replace that item there. And the important point that, one point that we could drive home is that a clean home really shouldn't smell like anything. Like it shouldn't smell like chemicals. It shouldn't smell like artificial scents or synthetic fragrances. It should just have no real discernible smell at all. That would mean that your air is cycling pretty well, that it's been cleaned pretty well, you have good exchange, and you haven't introduced a lot of chemicals and things that have built up. So, very simple things are just looking at, swaps of whether it's laundry detergents or, cleaning sprays or products or candles. Just try to go for the more, natural ones. Like even if you like using candles, like try to switch to pure beeswax, instead of like a very synthetic chemical heavy one. It's simple things like that that are just going to ultimately you're reducing the load inside your home, like your chemical load. And when you make these swaps and these changes very simple, um, you're doing yourself a lot of favors from an air quality perspective. So a lot of things like that. As far as just common activities too, use your rain hood when you're cooking. A big one is that people will cook and then they'll either they forget to turn the range hood on or they only use it when they cook and then they switch it off as soon as they're done cooking. You should let that run for a good period of time, even afterwards, because that's also helping to pull, it's in a way, it's helping to ventilate a little bit. It's also just helping to pull some of those, the stuff that's produced from the hot stove and the oils and everything like that, pull it directly out of your kitchen space and into the hood and out of the house too. Um, Also important point is make sure it's actually venting outside as well. I've seen a number of cases where that range hood actually just vents into the cupboard above the stove. That's not doing anything. You're just putting it back right into your house, so that's no good. Um, Bathroom fan too. When you use use your shower, run the bathroom fan, not just during the shower, but a good period of time after. Like my general rule of thumb is for every 5 minutes that the shower is being used, I like to have the fan running for a half hour after it's finished. So if it's been a 10-minute shower, run it for an hour. Because effectively, when you take a shower, you more or less added like a bucket of water into your bathroom there. And then that has to go somewhere. But if you don't have the fan running, it's just going to stay inside the space. It's going to, pool on the floor. It's going to stay on the shower walls or the curtain. But that water then is going to evaporate into the bathroom airspace. Often the bathroom's pretty closed off. I mean, how often are we taking a shower with the door completely closed? So you're making, again, this airtight space. And if the fan's not running for enough time, it's a lot easier for mold and other things to start developing in that way. So very, very simple fixes that you can do and little actions we can take right now that can improve your air quality in that sense.
Yeah, and speaking kind of similar to the kitchen fan, I've heard some horror stories of where those bathroom fans actually just go up into like the attic and they don't actually vent all the way outdoors. And then obviously, so that's all that humidity coming from your showers all day, every day, just floating around upstairs in like the kind of crawl space or whatever you call it,
Hmm.
attic, whatever you would call it. And basically, just like obviously just going to create moisture and mold there because it's all wood. So you have to make sure your fans are actually vented out of your house properly. I think most people wouldn't really think to pay attention to that, or maybe they just rent the home and they have no idea. But I got very lucky. The last place I rented had a hood fan. It was all remodeled. They had a kitchen hood that went outside. I don't have the luxury of that at my new condo, which sucks. But then, but at least the bathrooms are vented outside, so that's good. But I've heard some horror
Yeah.
stories where people design it because they think like, okay, we just get the humidity out of the bathroom, everything's good, instead of just doing one extra step where it goes out of the roof and just make sure that it actually goes outdoors. So you could be actually creating problems with your bathroom fan if the structure of your house is not done properly.
We saw that a number of times, unfortunately, where we checked the attic space, and sure enough, the bathroom fan, either it was venting into the attic, or it did vent outside, but there was a kind of a break in the seal somewhere, and
Mm.
so then the air was just, of course, not going outside; it's just going back into the attic. And like you said, that's the big problem is with those attic spaces. It's basically like plywood and insulation. It's all these materials that mold has a super easy time to grow on. So, you're using that bathroom fan religiously, and now you think, okay, I'm doing a good job of pulling the moisture out, but then it's just going into the attic space, and you're creating this huge breeding ground for mold. And then what happens is, because you also have a situation where it's not venting directly outside, you now have that sort of gap where, like, your bathroom fan goes into the attic, or there's the broken seal. Now those mold spores can potentially go back down into the bathroom, into the living spaces of your home through the vents. And you're now having the situation where mold is coming in because you're creating it in the attic and it's cycling back through, without even realizing what's going on. And I think most homeowners probably never check their attic at all. Maybe they get the home inspection before, but it's not one of those things, like you said, that's often looked at. So it's a very, literally takes, 2 minutes, just pop in your attic, make sure it's venting outside. If so, you're good to go already.
Yeah, I have I love my mold guy that I have here in Tampa, and he was up in the at the this place doesn't have one, but the last place he was all up in the attic, and but it was all remodeled. They had done all new wood, everything was vented properly, but it isn't always done that way. Is what he kind of told me. He's like, so you still want someone to come out here. He had all his little blue lights and red lights or whatever his lights were that pick up mold and all the things that kind of help him get an eye for what's going on without the actual mold test coming back, and everything was good. But he told me that there's just some crazy attic stories of, yeah, I guess it's not always done improperly, but something tears or something breaks off, and then the moisture builds up there. For anyone, this is the last question I have here because I'm fully bought in. Obviously, I have saunas and I have all these biohacking things. Right, I'll spend money on this stuff. I think it makes sense, but for the average person who's maybe um, doesn't want to go spend money on air purifiers right off the jump. Is there any kind of like test that you would recommend? Like mold is specific. Like most people kind of feel like they have mold and they get really sick from it. But is there like a common test for like VOCs and other particulates that someone could do it to see kind of where they're like kind of fall, like a at-home
Mhm.
test?
Sure. I mean, you could look into an air monitor. There's a lot of home air monitors that aren't super expensive, and they can tell you. It'll give you a very sort of rudimentary look. It's not going to, like, again, break down what kinds of chemicals or particulates, but in a broad sense, it'll tell you what's your CO2. What are your total VOC levels. I do. We usually say exercise a little bit of caution with those, because truth be told, if you want to get a really accurate look at VOCs, it's usually better to get those monitors that can give you a lot more data in terms of what kinds. Problem is, they're very expensive. Like, I would honestly say, if you really want to check VOC levels, you're probably better off hiring an environmental consultant to come in. They will have the equipment, either they send stuff to the lab or they have the sophisticated monitors that otherwise would cost you probably several thousands of dollars, but they will tell you exactly what's going on with VOCs. The home monitors, the ones for maybe a few $100, it could give you maybe a very broad spectrum, so you could still get a rough idea of total VOC. But CO2, particularly like PM2.5, maybe humidity as well, they can all tell you that, and that's a very good starting point. It's going to tell you a pretty good baseline of, okay, how's my ventilation? Is the CO2 high? How's my humidity? Do I have to add a dehumidifier or a humidifier? How are my particulates? Do I need to add some kind of air filtration or air scrubbing? So that can still give you a very good starting point of where you're at. But one thing that we really would distinguish is that even if you do have, this item there, at the end of the day, you will still have a lot more benefit of taking these steps of improving your air quality. Whether it is adding an air filtration system or an HRV/ERV, or just making sure you have better air exchange or humidifier. Um, it's going to do you a lot more favors if you still take the good steps to focus on them. In terms of the cost of what it is to run your home, buying a home, and whether it's renovations and upkeep, these things are really microscopic. Like, they're minuscule on the long term and even on a yearly spend, but they make a big difference and a big impact in a very positive way of just ensuring that you're living the day-to-day healthiest life that you possibly can.
Awesome, man. Thanks for breaking that down for us. And I agree. I always tell people it doesn't sound fancy or biohackery or health space cool to like when people ask me, like they're all asking about saunas or hydrogen machines, and I'm like, if you don't really have like, you should spend all of your money, if that's all you have, on a air filtration or air scrubbing machine and water purification. Like, you shouldn't be
Hmm.
buying any kind of device. Maybe a sauna. I think a sauna is pretty critical in today's toxic world, but you still, if you're in the sauna and you're breathing in crappy air and drinking crappy water, then the sauna doesn't really make sense. So I kind of have gotten to this place where I'm like, you need to focus on air and water first. And there's tons
Hmm.
of good water systems, whole home systems. I like Greenfields. Mito Life has a good one that I think he kind of is switching the way he's doing it. Matt Blackburn, my buddy, but there's lots of good ones on the market. You can even do RO if you for cheaper, and add some minerals back in if you wanted to kind of even save a few bucks. But water and air are two things that you're drinking the most of, and you're breathing definitely all. Air. It'd be a toss up on an argument, but I would say air might even be more critical to start with. You could probably take some binders or zeolites and drink kind of crappy water for a minute, but I don't like to do either. Those are my two non-negotiables, like the water and the air. So I'm glad you guys broke it down. I really love the Jasper. Everybody go check it out. I'll have a link in the show notes. Where can people find more information? I know there's studies on the website. Is there any other kind of material that they can get into to learn more about the Jasper?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a number of studies on the website there. I mean, a lot of that is just kind of general FAQ and air education. So, how it works and the importance of air cleaning. But we do have some studies, from our mold testing and other ones that we're going to be doing as well. That's all available there. Our Instagram at Jasper Co, and that's JASPR, no ECO. That's where we're often posting, just any kind of latest studies, or even, simple tests that we've done on um, different kind of airspaces. Like, one of actually the more fun ones that we did was we just have a CO2 monitor that Michael, our founder, likes to bring around everywhere he goes, and I do mean everywhere. And he'll test it on airplanes, on buses, like wherever he's at, and it's kind of a fun way of just seeing what's the CO2 in the day to day life, that we're going through. Not that we can make many changes to that, but it's just kind of a fun thing to see. Where do we stand on a regular basis as far as these common methods of transportation? So we post stuff like that, and then of course any questions that anybody has, we have our main inbox you can reach out to. It's just the team at jasper.co, and we're happy to answer any questions there. And obviously the Jasper itself, we really look at it as an educational tool, for your airspace, to see what kind of contaminants go up when you're cooking, and maybe when you're using scented candles or anything of that sort, or incense, and just gives you a good way of knowing what's going on in your space, and giving you the peace of mind as well that you're doing the best you can to keep your everyday breathing at a healthy level.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Before you go, why is there no E in Jasper? Is there some kind of encrypted message going on here?
No,
What?
it's actually, so the quick version of it. The name Jasper came from Michael's background was, when he was in Canada at the time, because that's where we're both from. Now we're in Austin. That's where we're based, Austin, Texas. But in Canada, he was in Alberta, and there's a mountain called Jasper Mountain. That's near
Mm.
Banff National Park. And Jasper is one of the cleanest airspaces basically in the world, on the top of the mountain there. And so that's where the inspiration for the product came from. But the simple version of it is that the studies as far as the internet marketing have shown that when you take a product name and make it not an exact word but slightly change it, it tends to get a bit more resonance. So, like, for example, if this was named Jasper with the E after the mountain, apparently, I'm not an internet marketing expert myself, but
Me
apparently
neither.
you don't get as much sort of interest gauge versus when you remove a vowel or two. So that's why you'll often see actually a lot of brands out there they'll, and especially I think it's kind of the newer trend where they'll remove a couple vowels or like just do the consonants, but you still know what the word is. So
Yeah.
that's basically where Jasper came from. But the inspiration was from the mountain itself. That's where the name
Okay.
came from.
All right, cool. Maybe I'll keep that in mind. Over at my company, we got to remove some vowels.
There you go.
All right, brother. Thanks so much. Stick around while I close out the show.
Sounds good.